So right now we've got a test suite that's humming along here. Actually, should probably change this so it's not running in verbose mode or debug mode. Going up here, and this is going to be info. And we'll go back in and rerun this. So actually took the last branch that we had and put it back to merge what we had into our master branch. And let's actually do the same thing here. So let's set up a branch for basically adding a router and testing out a router. So let's go in here and we'll say git.checkout branch, and we'll say set up states. Okay, and let's actually make sure that we end up adding in our Karma config, since I just made a change to it. Move debug. Okay. So what we're going to do here is that let's actually get rid of a couple of these things, and let me go over here, and we're going to add a test. I'm going to call this states spec.js. And we'll go over here and we're going to want to bring in our app. Let's actually describe our states. This is kind of an interesting thing to do. And let's describe, let's say we're going to have a state for employees. Now, if we expect that URL to be /employees, we could actually write our expectation. It has the URL /employees. So let's go over here. And we'll write the expectation. Expectation URL to equal /employees. All right, and that's going to not break because that's going to break because that variable doesn't even exist. And this will load up. Should probably take out that console.log of our template, but it's not bothering me that much. And again, the URL doesn't exist, so it says you have a reference error. That's fine. So how are we going to populate that? Well, what we actually want to do is actually get our, it's interesting, the state provider has a method to actually go and access a state. So you could say state.get, get me the state that exists, and assuming we have a state called employees, we're going to want to take the employees and we're going to be able to grab the URL. Now, we don't have this state, so let's actually get this state, and we'll do our before each, and this is going to be module our app, and we're also going to do before each, and we're going to inject a function, and we're actually going to grab our, we'll say state. So this is going to be, we'll put this as a global variable, and we'll say state equals underscore state. Okay? So once we end up doing that, now we're going to run into a problem here, and the problem that we're going to run into is probably a bigger issue, is that state provider doesn't exist. And that's true. The state provider doesn't exist because we need to, in order to have the state provider exist, we need to have our UI router. Okay? Now, that's going to lead to another problem because we don't have our UI router available. So we can actually get that by doing an npm install Angular UI router, save. That's not a dev save. That we need to just save. We need it for our, we're going to need it for our application. And if we go and do that, we should see that this Angular router ended up getting installed over here. And we can see we've got this release Angular UI router. So again, if I want to use this in my test, I'm going to bring in what I need for Angular. So now this is going to be Angular UI router. And this is in a src file, Angular UI router. And let's just make sure I got that right. So Angular UI router, actually it's going to be release that I want. So again, that's changed to the config file. Let me kill this. It's killed already. Let's clear my screen out and run this. So it should end up finding the state provider, but the problem is that state doesn't exist. So let's actually set up the state. So where do we set up the states? We could either set it up in a config file, in which case, we might do something like this, config.js, and then we could go in here and we could say Angular module app, and we can configure our providers. And the provider that we're going to configure is going to be this state provider. So state providers are fairly easy to set up. We're going to have our state provider is going to have a state, and the state is going to be employees. And for now, we could just do this. As a starting point, we can just give this a URL of /employees. And let's see if that ends up passing. So state is not defined. So I forgot a period here. Let's put that in. And we end up passing, but we always want to fail first, right? Just to make sure we ended up doing what we should have done. So let's go back here, and I'm just going to get my test to fail by going in here. And let's say that we expect this URL to be this, and we'll get a quick failure. And now we'll get a quick pass. So now we end up passing. So this is kind of an interesting thing. Let's just see what else we can end up getting by looking at this state. So we go over here and we say state equals state.get employees, and then we say state URL. Let's just do a console.log of state and see what we've got. So here's our URL, here's our name. Let's set up a couple of other things here on our state, which we sure want to have. So if we end up going here, let's say that this is going to be using a controller, and this is going to be the employees control. If we go back here, we'll see that we have our controller. So this is probably not a bad test to put in here to also specify. We could do this a little bit easier. Expect the state controller. Let's just do that to get it to fail. And we really expect it to be employees control, which we already have tests for, so we don't need to write tests for that here. Here we're just testing out our state. And while we're also at it here, why not actually have a state for employees, an actual employee? So let's say it doesn't exist yet. Let's say that we want to have in our app some kind of employee state. This is going to have some /ID. And so when we say state get the employee state and we pass in an ID of 3 and we look at the state, we're going to expect this to be employees 3, and we'll leave this off for a moment. So this state doesn't exist yet. Can't read the URL of a state that doesn't exist. And we'll go back and we'll change this to our employee state. This is going to be employee /ID, and we'll eventually have a control called the employee control, and this should dynamically get us our state. So we expected the ID to equal employees 3, so let's fix that. So actually this URL that I end up getting here is going to be the sort of raw URL. And so really what I want to do here, so this actually gets me the state, but if I want to get the URL that ends up getting generated from it, the way that I would actually do it is to say URL and ask my state object, hey state object, here, give me the href, and I could either do this by name or actually pass in this state, and here I'll say ID is equal to 3, and now this URL, which is the generated URL, is still going to be incorrect, but that's going to be incorrect for another reason. And here is that it's going to be expecting this. Let's actually just take a look with our config. So this is actually, I want this to be sort of a RESTful looking route, and also I'm going to have this pound symbol here. We could talk about getting rid of that at some point too. We could do that with the route provider, but this is going to be the actual URL for that particular state, and that actually works. So these are, again, some ways that you can end up testing out state and looking at state. Other things you could do is that if in fact you had a controller, let's say a list, and you ended up deleting something from the list, or probably a better example is you had a detail, you were on a detail view, you had some detail controller, you deleted something, you could go in and you could tell your scope of that controller to delete, and what you could do is mock the state's go method to see in fact that it would end up going to the proper state after something ended up getting deleted. So all kinds of different ways that you could end up testing your state object out so that you end up going to the right parts of the application. And here we got some, we should be somewhat assured that if we went in here and actually created the actual application and set it up, that things would actually work. And so that's the next thing we're going to do, is actually wire up our Angular application and talk about how we could actually go and push this to GitHub and use a continuous integration provider to run our tests every time we end up pushing something up to GitHub. So again, this fairly simplistic application, only a few different objects that we have here. We've got a lot more code for our tests than we do for the app. That's totally fine. There are things that we could do to sort of dry out all of our apps instead of having to put this stuff in here all the time. The module app, we could pull this out into some kind of file that loads before any of our tests load. That's something we could take a look at. But right now, this is going to do what we think it's going to end up doing. So the next thing we'll do is look at how to set up the actual Angular app and look at some continuous integration.